5.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? Hope you've had a good day, and we are off to the races to look at some more developments. So this is Ann Lindsley from Bel Air High School, and I am going to talk with us today about development. I hope everyone had a All right, so let's see, I already told you that. So our first topic is going to be with Unit 7, Industrial and Economic Development Patterns and Processes. And we're looking at economic sectors and patterns. I know yesterday you started with 7.3, but that was just a broader scale, and this is going to come in and we're going to talk about 7.2. So our warm-up for today is going to deal with yesterday's questions and having a bit of a feedback issue. So our questions yesterday describe one social challenge for cities in less developed countries. How would you look at answering this question? One social challenge for cities in less developed countries. So here we're looking at the urban unit with development coming in here to play. So we're looking at a social challenge. So maybe you answer things like hopefully high poverty rates, high unemployment rates, high homeless, squatter settlements. Hang on one second here. All right, so the next question, describe one environmental challenge for cities in more developed countries. Here in this, an environmental challenge for this would include pollution, waste from manufacturing, smog and ozone, perhaps also flooding from overbuilding, and abandoned spaces, disease, and pests also could be an answer here. The other thing also is anything that contributes to countries or to the country's development. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a repeat. I'm hearing myself coming back in the microphone and I'm not able to get it out. All right, so I gotta have this. All right, so our next question deals with it to explain how supranational organizations such as the United Nations can support urban sustainability. Here we might look at how UN could help fund programs, and they could set up, for example, education programs or infrastructure, fresh water, clean water, waste removal pipes, anything that would help to bring in and to support the infrastructure to then improve the development status of that particular place. And so we're dealing with the political unit, we're dealing with the economic situation, and also with the urban unit here. The last question, discuss how urban growth creates similar challenges in both more developed and less developed countries. What kind of urban challenges that we would have that would be a factor for development. In both of these cases, we would look at density. How does continued development influence density? And this is going to come from migration into areas for job potential. The other thing also is going to be transportation, and then once again, environmental issues like pollution control and waste removal, trash removal. So hopefully you picked up on some of those. If not, you can always come back and look at these again and go back and think about some of those answers. All right, so our topic today is going to be looking at dealing with the skill relationships that we see within spatial relationships, explaining spatial relationships in specified context or region of the world, using geographic concepts, processes, models, or theories. So we are looking at the Essential Knowledge 7B1. And in 7B1, we're looking at the different economic sectors, including primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and quinary, and how those are characterized by distinct development patterns. So what do they look like? And so I'm going to go through each one of these. Hopefully you've already had these. Y'all all have excellent teachers. And this is a pretty easy concept, but it's the application of it sometimes we have to think about. But I know your teachers, if they haven't already taught it, maybe it was something that they were going to absolutely cover, but this is the way we start to categorize development, categorize places around that development. So the different sectors, once again, they're written out there for you. The different sectors, essentially the model calls for looking at the three sector model: primary, secondary, and tertiary. But tertiary has been divided off into quaternary and quinary also because of the unique services that are involved in those, mostly dependent upon the high-tech industries. One thing I want to point out is the role of the economic sectors in the overall GDP of countries. So you have two pie charts here, one of developed countries and the other of developing. The developed countries, as you'll see, the big blue area is the service industries. That's your tertiary level. The developed countries have most of their GDP, almost 69% of their GDP, coming from the service industries. Whereas in the developing countries, they are almost at 59%. That's still very, very high. Probably not what you might have expected. Perhaps you might have expected most of it to be agricultural. No, they still have to process and distribute foods. They still have to move stuff. They have to provide services for the population. So you still have, even in your lowest of developing countries, a large service industry that does apply to the GDP. So we can also see how this is spatially mapped out as well. Your largest area of agricultural and secondary or manufacturing is, for the predominant of the GDP, is still in North Africa, Central Africa, and then some spots here in East and Southeast Asia. But that, given the scale of that, it really doesn't quite give you all the aspects of their sources of their income. But let's look at how this looks on the landscape. The primary sector is extraction industries. Your farming, your fishing, your forestry, your mining. These primary industries are extracting the raw materials, the raw resources, which then are going to be shipped to other places or located for somewhat nearby on-site manufacturing. In developed countries, what you have is a high degree of mechanization. You have a low labor portion in this part of the economic sectors. So much of farming is mechanized, mining is heavily mechanized, and fishing, depending upon what kind of nets you're pulling and what you're fishing for, is also aquaculture or heavily mechanized, making it easier, particularly compared to developing countries. In developing countries, and a lot of improvised tools with a lot of human labor. So in the in the primary sector, also we look at the value of this, because if for example in the United States, the perception is very few people farm. In fact, less than 3% of the entire population of the United States has anything to do with any kind of food production. So that's very, very few people relatively, but it still has almost a 1% contribution to our GDP from the primary sector. So 76 billion, for example, comes in from minerals, from mining, 208 billion from fisheries, and then another 90 billion is also going to be contributed from agricultural sector. So it's pretty large amounts of money from something that doesn't have very many workers in it, comparative to our other sectors. Then if we look at things a little differently here in terms of a global scale, our contribution to the agricultural sectors, the largest amounts coming out of Africa and South and Central Asia. But I thought what was also interesting was the balance of the labor force, which is down in this map, the balance of the labor force engaged in agriculture, because even though you have fewer smaller contributions to the overall GDP in some areas, you still have large numbers of people in the labor force working in agriculture. So then the next thing also is the value added. Now, this is an interesting way to actually talk about mechanized agriculture or developed agriculture in your more developed countries, because you're looking at the agricultural value added per worker. Well, if you have few workers, then those workers are going to be, when the math is all done, they're going to contribute more value per person. So if we take that and we consider what that's saying, that what it is actually saying is that heavy mechanized agriculture has fewer workers, and those fewer workers are contributing a lot more to that GDP. Okay. All right. If we look at the secondary sector is the sector of the economy, including industries that produce a finished usable product or are involved in construction. And this sector generally takes the output of the primary sector and manufactures it into the final goods for sale to domestic and foreign consumers. This supports both the primary and the tertiary sector, because you don't need the primary sector if you're not going to do anything with the raw materials. And then there's no service industries that are going to develop if you aren't manufacturing something that then has to be distributed. So that then requires us to start looking at, well, where is everything coming from? Well, your less developed countries are producing more of the primary sector materials. They're producing more of the raw materials. And then your MDCs are manufacturing those products. And that is definitely what you are seeing here in the map in the top left. I thought this one was kind of interesting when I was going through preparing the slides, because this is actually an export map. And what are the main products that countries are exporting? And when you start to look between the MDCs, the more developed countries versus the less developed countries, you see that the less developed countries are producing raw materials for export, yet your MDCs, United States, Canada, Russia, some of the others in Europe are producing manufactured products that are needing to be used to make other products or to trade on the world market. So secondary products or secondary processing, manufacturing in developed countries is highly industrialized, highly mechanized. Very little human labor is used to assemble products in most of these operations today. These areas in developing countries, it's reversed. Now, we're not comparing the same products. That's another factor to consider here. Outsourcing of labor to Bangladesh and Guatemala, Cambodia, the Philippines, even India, a lot of this is still done by hand, but these are also products that are not as expensive as the ones that are being produced here in the developed countries. The food processing and cars and technology equipment. These places are producing in the developing countries a large volume of textiles. And so one of the ways that those prices are kept down is to have a lot of manual labor working for low cost and producing those textiles. And that opens up a whole nother set of problems and issues and things to be considered in terms of development. In the tertiary sector, we are looking at the tertiary or the service sector. And the service sector consists of production of services instead of end products. So we're talking about the production of information, which actually is going to be split off to your quaternary and also to your quinary sectors. It involves, services involve the transportation, the distribution and sale of goods from the producer to the consumer. And in these areas, it's also going to include health and education, water, sanitation. It accounts for a significant portion of the GDP in most countries, including low-income countries, because these are all going to need to be done in order to support the population. So this is the global average of the service industry. It's 63%. And then your manufacturing at 30, and then 6.4 for your primary industries. All right, so what does the service industries or service sector look like in developed countries? Well, a lot of tourism, online banking or electronic banking, transfer of monies, things like this, where you don't go into a fixed location. It's highly interconnected in terms of distribution of goods and services and information. Also, lots of transportation of cargo and goods, and then education. This is actually a picture of a couple of my students, and we were in West Yellowstone when it snowed in October. And so they were learning a whole nother type of climate and everything from me, their teacher, while they were out here in this region doing field work. So, but this is something that we see as a common practice in developed countries. It becomes a little bit more challenging to do in some countries. Other countries, if you don't have the right kinds of transportation and the monies to be able to put it together. In developing countries, in the service sectors, it's going to look a little bit different. Now, I totally do not want to make stereotypes or anything. So these are just different images. That does not mean they don't have trucks here. They do have trucks, but people are going to resort to all kinds of resources in order to move goods so that they can get them to the market to sell them to make money. So anything in any way is possible. This particular image of girls in a classroom in India, they're all working on computers. So this is a new way in developing countries that supranational organizations, governments themselves have helped to try to bring up development levels. And then yet another traditional classroom also in India in a rural area. So the next sectors, the quaternary and the quinary sectors, are breakoffs of the tertiary sector. And in these areas, we're dealing with the quaternary sector, we are dealing with information technologies, research and development, we're dealing with communication and consultants. It's based upon the pure knowledge and skills of a person. This part of the economy deals also with knowledge-oriented economic sectors. So using research and development, information technology in order to improve or create new ways, much like what we're having to do right now. Online education, that falls in under this. This is not, that falls in as a quaternary that we're having to use online high-tech means with which to communicate with you all so that we can help you feel comfortable with completing the course and be ready for the exam coming up. Quinary activities are services that focus on controls such as government and creation of non-routine use or creation of information. So using information to create new technologies, new types of research to go even further. This is the highest level of decision making. This is also highly paid skills of senior business executives come into play here as well. So that's a quick rundown, very quick, of the 3 economic sectors model with the 2 quaternary and quinary as a break off of the tertiary. The second essential knowledge area in this particular topic is 7B2, and it's dealing with some things that we've already talked about a little bit with the urban, but now we have to bring it together to understand why we talked about with the urban area. And this deals with labor and transportation, the break of bulk point, and then least cost theory and core periphery, semi-periphery locations. Those are some theories that we see that come into play here with development. So let's go back to break of bulk. Why are some places where they are? The idea here is the study of industrialization the study of industrialization, it helps to explain why some places become industrialized before others. So why was New York City? Why was Philadelphia? Why Houston here in Texas? Why portions of Los Angeles? Why were those areas more industrialized before others were? And that has to do with these places being a break of bulk point, where goods could be brought in from other places and then they would be distributed through other means of transportation deeper into the country to distribute to the population that demanded them. Now, what begins to happen is that you begin to have support industries that develop around the break of bulk, around the port areas. And so then you begin to have manufacturing that's going to develop in this area, and manufacturing needs support industries, these service industries. And so you're going to have, that's going to pull migration in, that's going to pull more people to come in. And then you end up with, over time, this place that begins as a port that now is a site of heavy manufacturing, light manufacturing, distribution and transportation of goods and services. And then also all of the service industries that need to go to support those people who are doing that. And now you have a massive city that has evolved over time. So part of what goes into some of that decision is contributed to by Alfred Weber in the least cost theory. Least cost theory is something you need to be familiar with. Look for this on, think about this in terms of all kinds of manufacturing. So Alfred Weber formulated the least cost theory of industrial location to explain and predict locational patterns of industry at a macro scale, okay? And what he was seeking to do is to figure out why places locate where they do, because what they're ultimately trying to do is to minimize transportation and labor cost. So the point for locating an industry has to be the place that minimizes the cost of transportation and also labor, okay? So when talking about least cost theory, we have to look at two aspects. We look at bulk reducing and bulk gaining. So a product that we are going to turn into another product, or a resource that we're going to make into a product, begins with a raw material. And if that raw material has to get to market before it's broken down, you're going to have a lot of costs associated with moving tonnage, as well as having to manufacture it at the site. So the idea is that bulk reducing at the source, then you move that portion of the raw material, saves on transportation costs. So if you think about coal, or you think about ore, copper ore, iron ore, you want to break it apart from all of the overburden or the material that is not the ore, okay? You want to break that apart and then just move that portion to a factory, a processing plant that then reduces it down even further. So if you, for example, are mining core or copper ore, like the Kennecott mine in Salt Lake City, if you are taking the copper out of the veins, you are going to then process it through a means of which it is going to eventually have electricity sent through there, which will pull the copper off and eventually create these sheets of copper that then get exported out in their raw form to other places to be used as in electronic components or in other kinds of wiring materials. So you have to reduce the bulk ore or the bulk material at its site. So factory operations will happen right there, break it down into a smaller amount, and then ship that. Now, you also have the flip side of that, and that is bulk gaining. So we have a raw material and now we're going to use it for something else, and we are going to need to do that closer to the market to cut down on those transportation costs. So if we go back to our raw copper that we transported by rail or by train or by truck out of the Salt Lake City region, and we are going to now send it to California, send it someplace else to then have little tiny pieces of it used to make computer components. What will happen is you send the large sheets of that copper to where those light manufacturing are occurring, where they will then use those pieces of copper to make copper wiring, copper components, and then put those into the computers themselves, the cell phones, whatever's being used. So that's going to happen closer to your market. I hope that makes sense. So here's our market. We are extracting the raw material, processing it to some extent out here, breaking it down, and now we are going to move it to the market. This occurs when the product is more costly to transport than the raw material. Okay, so the completed computer is going to be bulkier and heavier than the little amounts of copper that go into each one of those. So we can transport that copper closer to the factory. All right, so where does break of bulk come into play with this? On a larger scale, we receive raw materials from all over the world, and those raw materials are going to be shipped in by ship, which can carry tons and tons and tons of cargo. And then they are going to come into the port, which then they will be broken down in the port area and shipped off into by trucks or by plane. Well, what evolved is actually doing some of the factory process at the break of bulk place. So heavy cargo comes in off of the ships, and then it goes to manufacturing locations in and around that particular city. And then that raw material is broken down into more completed parts, and then those parts are shipped out by truck usually to other assembly plants or directly to the market for sale. So if we kind of look at some things if we look at some things at the period of time in American history, we know about hopefully the city of Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, this whole region that's right in here of Appalachia. And this area became our heavy manufacturing location. And well, why there? Market is New York. The market is over here on the East Coast. Well, because least cost theory was in effect. So we're shipping iron ore from mines up on the northern end of Minnesota and portions of Michigan. And we are shipping those through the Great Lakes. Remember, through ships, we can move tons and tons at a time for less expense. So that iron ore is going to be shipped all the way down, brought into some of the port areas around Toledo, along Lake Erie, and then are going to be railed or brought in by canal as well to areas around Pittsburgh. And in this region became the heavy manufacturing industrial area, because this is also where the coal was. And then also later they'll discover oil here. But this is where your coal was. So we would bring the coal in, we bring the iron ore in, all of that would come here, be transported by rivers here. This is, some of you may be familiar with Three River Stadium, Pittsburgh. It's not there anymore, but there were three rivers, the Ohio, the Monongahela, and the Allegheny, which raw materials, these ore, could be brought into this region to then be distributed and manufactured into steel, which then would be sent by rail to New York for the market or to ship to Europe. So part of the decision about where to locate a manufacturing plant is going to be based upon the weight of the raw material, how much, how heavy is it, and how much does it cost to transport it. The other factor that's going to be included here is your labor cost. So that's one of the things that we see today, is that our labor costs have become such issues in some areas that we have to go to other places to have a less expensive labor cost. And that then takes us to this concept of the core periphery model, originally part of Wallerstein's world systems theory. So the core periphery model is looking at, let's go with the global level first. The core periphery model is looking at how it is looking at how the relationship between the raw materials and production and the market all are balanced out. Now, this was a theory that was put forth by Wallerstein, who is a sociologist. And so he was looking at uneven spatial development caused by our manufacturing and trade system between the developed world and the less developed countries. So you had to kind of be familiar here with the terms. The core were the wealthy, developed capitalist countries. The core are the areas that are extracting profits from the periphery. Well, who are the periphery? The periphery were the poor dependent nations that were in many cases further away from the core. And then you also had the semi-periphery. The semi-periphery are the semi-industrialized nations who've benefited from more direct trade with the core. And they also may have more manufacturing abilities, more labor trained abilities, or they also may have some more valuable natural resources. And so they've developed a stronger relationship with that core, and thus are benefiting from the exchange of labor and market goods. So the investment here comes from a few core countries. And right now you see that investment in places of West and East Africa from China, who is going in and trying to set up manufacturing operations so as to access natural resources and in some cases, some of the labor. What ultimately the argument with the world systems theory or the core periphery model is that it causes the poor countries to become dependent on the wealthy ones. And when they become dependent, then they no longer can manufacture things themselves because they're doing this for the core. And if they're to then purchase those manufactured goods, then they're forced to pay the higher prices. And it becomes a factor of availability of goods and those prices and maintaining a low labor costs. So if we look at it in a different kind of spatial nature, Harm Deblis, one time America's geographer before he passed away, he said that it is a model that describes how economic, political, and or cultural power is spatially distributed between dominant core regions and more marginal or dependent semi-peripheral, peripheral regions. The point that you also need to understand about this relationship is that it can happen at different levels of scale, okay? It can happen at different levels of scale. That means, come over here to our picture of China. We have a core periphery relationship within China, within the coastal area of China with its interior rural area. You have a much higher GDP on your coastal areas. You have modern global cities, high manufacturing, high degree of migration. Whereas you come into some of the central areas of China, you have a high degree of poverty, rural areas that have no aspects of manufacturing or produced goods. And if they don't make it themselves, then it doesn't exist, kind of a situation. But they are producing raw materials for their coastal edge. So kind of think about some other places where you might see a core periphery relationship within a country. For example, the United States between the North and the South an agrarian raw material supplying area for the North's manufactured food supply. You also see this between East and West Europe and between the North and the South of Europe. So it's interesting to see this relationship at different levels of scale, and I encourage you to look at it. So once again, let me go over the top 20 countries ranked by the United Nations Human Development Index make up the core. Now, this core, these are the leading economic developed countries. So if we look at the population unit, what do we see in terms of population of those countries? Well, those countries, a lot of them are having slowing to stagnant population growth rates. That's a factor. They have some of the lowest total fertility rates, okay? They also have a large portion of their populations that fall into the 60 years and above age group, so they don't have a younger population. Whereas you begin to look at the semi-periphery, and the semi-periphery countries are countries that contribute to the manufacturing and the exportation of a variety of goods, but they also have a strong, a little bit above the 2.1 replacement rate for fertility. So their populations are still growing, and those folks are still moving into the cities. Large numbers are moving into the cities. So you have a very rapid rural to urban migration. Some of these countries on the semi-periphery, Argentina, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, China, Iran. Those are all countries on the semi-periphery that are experiencing increased economic development as a result of their relationship with the core, but also a high degree of poverty, a high degree of squatter settlements and homelessness, and the ills that go along with overpopulated cities that are emerging to become mega cities. And Ms. Brandt talked about mega cities and meta cities the other day, and some of the problems that can happen with those. Well, this is why you have some of those problems. They have jobs in the manufacturing industries for goods that are going to be shipped to the core areas. The periphery is a region that's rapidly growing because of the number of factors. One is large numbers, traditionally large numbers of families, much higher than the 2.1 fertility, total fertility, or the replacement rate, I'm sorry. You have large numbers of people who live in squatter settlements. You also have mega cities growing in these areas where you have very, very localized manufacturing that is being done to provide for core countries who are providing investment monies into those countries. Some examples of these, Bangladesh, Cambodia would be another. Much of sub-Saharan Central Africa falls into this. They have either natural resources that are desired by your core countries, or they have an abundant labor pool that can produce goods at a less expensive cost. So we will use those places, and the core countries will use those places to manufacture their goods and then ship things back and forth across the world in containerized ships. All right, so looking at the two topics that we just covered, our economic sectors and then least cost theory, core periphery, break of bulk, manufacturing as a result of a use of a global system. I hope that very quickly made some sense. If we look at where we see this in other units, because once again, these last two units work backwards into our other subjects. So just to give you a frame of reference, regions have unifying characteristics or patterns. And we look at things at different levels of scale also when we look at regions. So looking at the concept of core periphery at the national scale, even in some states, you can look at core periphery. We can look at that definitely here in Texas. The manufacturing, trade, transportation north end of around Dallas versus our heavy agricultural end in the Valley of Texas. Florida has the same pattern, California a little bit different. But you can look at things at different levels of scale. And that is one of the biggest things that you guys can help yourself with, is not just pigeonhole something at, this is only be at a global scale, but what can I move into other scales to see the application of a lot of our topics. Other in population distribution, how does density and the distribution of the population affect political, economic, and social processes, including the provision of services? How do these mega cities, how do these manufacturing cities, these break of bulk points, What kind of services do they have to provide for this emerging population that's coming in to work? Something to think about. Your cultural landscape. How do these very same places, how does their cultural landscape change as their manufacturing changes or as their population changes coming in to work in these areas as a result of rural to urban migration or international migration? And migration, once again, chapter, what is that? Chapter 2, sorry, unit 2, not chapter, unit 2, population and migration. So this particular topic does work backwards into our other previous units that you will have on the AP exam, which, by the way, you want to make sure you tune in tomorrow because there was going to be some big announcements. All right, so if we were to look at some questions, some AP practice questions. Describe how the population of a place changes as society increases their secondary economic sector. So how does it change when we go from a primary, say, agricultural production to manufacturing? This is the change of the United States from the late 1800s into the 1920s and 30s, all the way, including post-World War II, 1940s and 50s. How do we change once we change how agriculture is done and move into manufacturing? How does a city explain how a city becomes a global city when it moves to quaternary and quinary economic sectors? So if you look at New York and Chicago, even Los Angeles, Houston, Dallas, how do we have these connections, Atlanta as well, how do we have these connections out to the wider world through technology, through decisions we make? We're seeing a lot of that right now, actually. Then question 3, explain how a break of bulk point develops into a core area for manufacturing. So we're looking at making that transition from break of bulk, an import-export area, and then broadening to manufacture. So that's least cost theory that's talking about. And then lastly, describe how the core controls the global market and the flow of goods. So this is the labor market and the market for raw materials. So once again, College Board would like for me to remind you that if you are having device issues and internet access issues, they have a solution for you. But you do need to contact them at cb.org/tech. And once again, make sure you tune in tomorrow for the big announcements from College Board regarding your AP exam. Ms. Branch should be able to give you some of those. If not, they will also be available on your AP access line. So y'all take care. Thanks for watching. Hey, we're geographers. Go out for a walk, explore the geography of your world, wash your hands, stay 6 feet apart from people, but go outside, breathe deeply, and have a great evening. Bye.